Welcome to the Art of We podcast. Today we have a special guest and a special topic. This is an explicit conversation, so if you have kiddos around, please put your earbuds in. We're talking about how trauma-informed sacred sexuality can support our journey of moving out of culturally indoctrinated good girl or good boy behaviors, and also disembodied performative behaviors, specifically in the bedroom, to come into more wholeness, embracing the multifaceted and beautifully complex beings that we are. Whether you're singled or partnered, you're going to get a lot out of this conversation with our guest, Amanda Testa. Former Southern Debutante turned sacred sexuality sex coach, Amanda has served hundreds of clients and thousands of students over the years with masterful skills in coaching, pleasure embodiment, and somatic trauma resolution. Her clients learn to heal their relationships with sexuality, embrace pleasure without shame, reclaim their sensual confidence, and cultivate partnerships that are incredibly rich and rewarding. In this episode, Will and I share some pretty intimate details of our own journey, and we definitely have taken away a lot of important perspectives and practices that we're going to be folding into our own intimacy moving forward. We hope you get as much out of this conversation as we did. Let's dive in. Hi, Amanda. Welcome to the Art of We podcast. We're so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's such an honor to be here with the both of you. Thank you for having me.
I want to just quickly get into this conversation because there's going to be a lot of questions I think that Will and I have, and then also that we can kind of channel the people who listen to the Art of We, questions that they might have. But I would love to hear a little bit about you becoming a sex coach after being a Southern debutante, which I don't know this story. I'm excited to hear about this. I'm wondering if you would kick us off with that.
People always ask, what in the world led you to go down this path? And I was raised in South Georgia in a pretty conservative environment, Southern Baptist upbringing, lots of religious conditioning, lots of good girl conditioning. Mm-hmm. I was very much taught to be pretty and pleasing and quiet.
Oof. Yes.
And it was hard for me. It was very hard for me. And I know growing up, I didn't really have many good tools to process a lot of that. So a lot of it was internalized with unhealthy behaviors and coping mechanisms, which were not supportive. And I ended up moving after I graduated from college. I went to the University of Georgia, and then I moved to Colorado. And one of the things that I realized is I'm now 51. So since 30 years kind of deprogramming myself from a lot of this, because, that turned out in my relationships, I felt a very big need to perform, to please. I wasn't able to speak my needs. And also, I had some sexual trauma that I have been healing for years as well. And part of that was not being able to speak up, not being able to defend myself or speak my needs. Mm-hmm. And so that was a lot of what I kind of moved through my life with, a lot of that conditioning to keep myself kind of stuck. And my only release was unhealthy habits, like binge eating or alcohol or all these unhealthy things. Mm-hmm. So as I, grew in life and had a very successful corporate career in sales and marketing, and I met my amazing husband after a long battle walking my father through early onset Alzheimer's. And so through that, I think that was some of the awakenings to, life is short. Mm-hmm. You can't live in this way and really not connecting to the truth of who you are. I think I had segmented a lot of different parts of myself. And when I started dating my husband, one of the things he told me was, I don't want you to be a Pollyanna, which that just blew my mind because I thought, wow, I've never heard that from anyone before.
What did he mean by that exactly?
Because I think he could see a lot of that pleasing behavior, right? Is like I wouldn't speak my mind fully or I would hold back. And he had been married before. He didn't want that. He was, very open to relating in new ways, which was a gift to me. And I remember being like, okay. Now he's probably like, I should have been careful what I've said. But it's great because I think part of this process too was just starting to unlearn some of that performance. So shortly after we got married, I got pregnant. And after my daughter was born, I found myself, it was a huge initiation in a lot of ways because I brought that type A personality and that wanting to do everything right to parenting. Mm-hmm. And I decided to stay home with her and really devote all of my being to this parenting role. And through that, I even more disconnected from myself. And I just remember one morning I think she was around a year old, and I was like tripping over toys, going to the bathroom. And I was just like, ugh, no one ever does anything around here, just grouchy and miserable. And I remember looking at myself in the mirror and having zero recollection with the person looking back at me. And I just thought in that moment, this is not how I want to live. Like, this cannot be my life. And I couldn't understand what I was doing wrong, because I was taking care of myself. I worked out. I had followed one of my passions around health and wellness, and I was a personal trainer, and I was teaching stroller stride, which was a workout for moms. I was involved in my community. I thought I was taking care of myself, but I was just deeply disconnected. So in that moment, I just made a commitment to following the breadcrumbs. And one of those breadcrumbs happened to lead to this course with one of my mentors. And I was thinking, all right, well, anyone with that's dealing with a lot can realize, like, often your sex life goes to the back burner. And so I thought, well, that surely could use some help. So let me just take this class and see what it's all about. And I think something in the advertising was around, connecting to your sexuality. I was like, well, sure, let's give that a go.
Right.
I never really realized I was disconnected from it. But through this class, I found, like, oh my gosh, this is like a whole world. As a well-educated woman, here I am in my 30s, and I've never learned about my own anatomy in this way. I've never learned all these things. And it really blew my mind. And afterwards, I just noticed such a change in my own body. And there was a lot of healing that went on, because, it was dealing with a lot of things somatically, like actually working with my body and my pelvis and all of these things to kind of release stuck stress cycles and stuck energy, so that I could have more feeling, more pleasure, and just more energy flow. And so that just blew my mind. And I was like, why are we never taught these things? I want to teach everyone about this, because it is so amazing and incredible. So that's kind of the start of it.
Let me ask you this too. Was your husband involved with the class at the time? Like, or were you doing this work on your own?
No, I was doing it all on my own. Yeah. Which I think was really important for me, because it was more about reconnecting to my own body in a new way. Because I think anytime we go through a life transition, even if it's just, I feel like every 5 years we go through another transition, and it's reconnecting to our body in new ways. And I didn't really have a lot of pain, but there was a lot of numbness and a lot of disconnection and a lot of disassociation happening that I wasn't even aware of. In all our sexual experiences, I thought they were great, but looking back, so much of it was around performing or doing things that I wanted that would make my partner feel good. It was all about doing it for them, which was some of that good conditioning I heard along the way too, of like, always please your husband, never say no, or they will find someone else. All this really unhealthy messaging.
Very Southern.
That is not about pleasure or your own joy in any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I can relate to a lot of that messaging, even though I didn't grow up in the South, but Will did grow up in the South. And I'm curious, just at a high level, Will, were you given that messaging as a male too, around not, making sure that you don't upset your partner, or you have to perform, or that kind of thing? Or did you not get that messaging specifically around like sexual connection?
Well, the messaging was mostly from my friends. There wasn't, and the culture at large, like I didn't actually get much direction or instruction from my parents, but there was definitely an ambient performative messaging that was happening for me and my friends too. And some of it, comes from movies and, internet pornography and all the things that teenagers are exposed to. And, nowadays it's much younger than teenagers. Unfortunately, little boys are getting into porn, I think I read somewhere 8, 10 years old. It's really crazy. But
what was the messaging?
The whole message of like, you should always be really hard. You should be ready to go. You should always be like, sex has a kind of very driving, kind of hard, kind of pounding, kind of, masculine warrior kind of vibe. Like there's no room in that messaging for relaxing and even really enjoying. It's more like conquering and winning and competing, like in the fraternity I was in college, it was all about that, like, oh, did you get laid last night after the party or whatever?
Or how many times?
How many times? Yeah, exactly. So So for sure. And,
Yeah.
I only went to one debutante event in Nashville growing up. Bless her heart, my date, who was assigned to me, of course, because that's how it was done, at least in the setting I was in, had 2 or 3 drinks at the beginning of the event, which I'm kind of, in retrospect, I'm wondering, like, how did that work? Because we were, 15 or 16 years old, and I don't think she'd ever had a drink of alcohol before, and she got really drunk and ended up in the bathroom of the place for the whole night throwing up. So it was kind of I hope that she doesn't have PTSD from that. But in any case, it was just a really intense set of messaging for boys too, I would say. And, there's really not much room for like slowing down, being present, experiencing any kind of creativity, or letting what's welling up inside of you drive what's happening, as opposed to just like a mental exercise of this is what I'm supposed to be doing right now.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And there's so many ways that I was culturally indoctrinated around different messaging as well. That is definitely not the conversation that we're having today. It's I think Amanda, you're going to lead us into a different kind of conversation. And I would say Will and I have done a lot of work around our sexuality in different ways, which we're very grateful for, but just wanted to relate with the conditioning and the place that you were coming from, and want to keep hearing the evolution of your story. Yeah, so many layers.
Many layers in many ways.
So please, thank you for sharing, and please continue on your story of how you continued to work those messages.
Yeah. So, through that's one of the things that really started my passion around learning more about sacred sexuality and sex, because it was always something I was interested in. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was great, but I didn't realize how much more there was to it. And I think one of the things I really realized in my relationship was how much it opened my heart to my partner, because I think there was a lot of layers of protection, a lot of layers of fear, a lot of layers of, part of the thing too, I realized is even in my 20s and 30s when I was, dating and living my own life and really kind of stepping into my own independence, was kind of the other edge of the pendulum, where I was like, I don't need anybody. I don't need a man. Why in the world would I want that? And so part of me was always protective of like, well, I need to have my own situation just in case it doesn't work out, right? I don't need to fully surrender into this because that's not safe. And so there was that layer of protection. And so, and I didn't realize like how much physically it was like in my chest and holding me back. So that was one thing. And I think the other thing between my husband and I, really understanding the wholeness. I think that's one of the things I love about the sacred sexuality is around, the wholeness. So often we have different aspects of ourselves, and we are, we segment these different parts of ourselves. And so maybe we have our desires feel like shadowy, dark things, or we don't allow them to see the light, or we don't share certain aspects of ourselves. And so those parts, they hold us back. And with this, in kind of in some of these teachings around tantric sexuality, which really is more about neo-tantra, when we weave in the sex and into it, because a lot of the classical tantric text is not so much about sexuality. This is kind of more of a new way of viewing it from a Western point of view that kind of happened in the 60s, but that we are, we weave these different parts of ourselves together so that we can see the divinity in all of who we are. And when we can see that in ourselves, it makes it much easier to see that in our partners, so that we can kind of get into states where we can realize we don't look at the day-to-day humanness of this person that maybe left the toilet seat up, right? We're like, this is like a divine being, and I want to like feel that connection to them in that way.
Is this a little bit similar to Part's work, like internal family systems?
It is in some ways, which is so interesting, because I think a lot of these ancient traditions are becoming more and more backed by science today, which is amazing. But yes.
Yeah. It also reminds me of this seeing each other as a divine being and not the person who left their seat up, which, by the way, Will does an amazing job of, not that I've ever asked you, but I always walk into the bathrooms. I don't have the seat up, but there's other things that could get into my way of seeing you as a divine being. Yes. But one of our relationship agreements that is probably, I think, one of the hardest ones for us, which is to see each other with fresh eyes every day, not as our filters of each other. And I really wonder how much that plays into this conversation of sacred sexuality, which we can get into that. But yes. I really appreciate you talking about the background of tantric sex, and then maybe you're going towards the difference of that between that and sacred sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what the difference might be in terms
Yes.
of this conversation.
I think this is a good question to note because Tantra is often misunderstood in the West. It's purely about sexuality, but it's actually a very profound and rich spiritual tradition that and philosophy that dates back thousands of years. But at its core, it really values both the body and the spirit as sacred, seeing them not as separate, but as interconnected aspects of divine energy. And so, and with classical Tantra, there's so many intricate rituals and teachings that require years of study and respect for lineage, because it's deeply rooted in Indian cultural, philosophical, and spiritual frameworks. So, specifically when I'm, teachers like Osho in the 60s that brought this tradition to the West kind of had a different way of bringing it that Western people could understand. And so I think a lot of these neo-tantric teachings that are based there, some of the beautiful things about it, though, are, it's really teaching us that our bodies in some ways are holy maps of the universe. And through embodiment practices, we can reconnect with our most sacred selves. And again, with that, when you're thinking in your relationship, it's that kind of concept of a sacred union where there's a really deep level and presence and connection that honors both partners as whole and divine. So that in turn, opens up these really profound levels of intimacy.
Well, I have so many questions already. I'm wondering if you do want to say anything more about your story before we get into...
We can dive in. Yeah.
Okay. But eventually you came to the place of like, this is where it's at. I want to bring more of this into the world. I want to be working with people. I want to be teaching. And you've been doing that for how many years now?
So I started doing a lot more study in in around 2012. And then in 2014 is when I started deepening my journey. And then I started, so with one of my teachers who I learned a lot of this from was Layla Martin. And so I did her Vita coaching certification in 2016. And then through that work, I realized right away, working with sexuality, that there are many layers and there's a lot of trauma and all the things woven in there. So I wanted to do more training specifically around trauma. So I have studied somatic experiencing and alchemical alignment and Rebloom, which is another coaching certification. So I've done a lot in that realm too, because it's so connected. I feel like you cannot tread these waters safely without a really strong base of support and care and safety. And again, we can only have a safe, brave enough experience that we can create. But it's like really, as you talk about a lot on this podcast, we have to have that base of emotional and physical safety to go deeper.
Yeah. Totally. Yes,
Definitely.
Absolutely. Well, I want to give you the opportunity to dive in here. If there's anything where you want to start,
I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna hold off for now because I don't want to jump ahead in the process.
Okay. Well, why don't we just start with, for the people who are listening, what are some misconceptions about, let's call it, sacred sexuality? Mm-hmm. And I'll kick off by saying that we're very excited to have you on this podcast. And when Will and I were talking a little bit about the topic, I think both of us can relate around the perspective of there's so many different people out there who are teaching a lot of different things around whether it's tantric sex or sacred sexuality. There's a lot of different ways to talk about it. Yeah. I feel like I've had many different experiences, the hardest ones being around feeling like what people are bringing in around the messaging feels very ungrounded. It feels very like super high energy versus embodiment, like what you're talking about. It feels like it's kind of this fantasy realm that you get into, and then all of a sudden you're out of it and you're back into reality of this plane, at least. So I'm just wondering what you would have to say about all of that, and what some misconceptions from your standpoint is around even talking about what sacred sexuality is and what the opportunity might be for people who are listening, if they have the same kind of setup that Will and I have.
I love it. It is true, because often when people hear Tantra, they think of like Sting having, marathon sex. And some of the things about that are, yes, it can be ways to tap into these heightened states of energy where you are able to sustain longer connections and connection to pleasure. And what I think about, we really are trying to bring a consciousness to sex. It's like bringing a more of a sacred experience to the everyday. And I think that's even a lot of mindfulness, right? It's a lot of weaving together a lot of these things that a lot of people in conscious partnership already do, but we don't we don't necessarily think of it as tantric or as sacred sexuality, right? Because I think when we are able to kind of drop into a deeper level of connection, and when oftentimes people come to this work because they're like, oh, I really want to have, full body orgasms, and I want to have so much more pleasure in my body. And part of that is you have to first do the not fun thing, which is unraveling all the pain and all of the blockages that are in your body first. Right? Because oftentimes, if we're thinking about that map, if we're thinking about, trying to take connecting to our sexual energy, number one, well, what even is that? It's really just our life force energy. It's like the aliveness within us, and allowing that to flow more freely up and through our body, as a very simple way to say it. And we can do this through practices. A lot of when I'm working with clients and they want to learn some of these practices, a lot of it is learned. But the thing is, you can't always just, if it was all just learned, then you would have everything you need to know just off YouTube or listening to a podcast, right? But often there's all the things that stand in the way, right? When we go to unwind the energy in our, in our root, for example, that's where a lot of our sense of belonging is, where a lot of our, in our navel and stuff, worthiness and belonging and receptivity and all of these things. So when we go to kind of open up these parts of our body, there can be physiological tension and blocks. And so some of the ways this shows up, which is also very connected with somatic experiencing, is, when we have these like tensions or we hear a message, say, for example, you're a kid and you are maybe looking at some porn, and then your mom comes in and you're like, oh, and you like shut it down. And there's a part of you that never fully got to let that go. And so maybe even in your body, there's like tightness in your pelvis, or there's like a shame around sex or pleasure. Right. So it's like when you start to open up to more energy and more sensation, then you realize like, oh, first I got to feel all these uncomfortable things. And maybe I want to cry, or maybe I'm super enraged and I feel like I need to kick someone or whatever it is. And so when we get to do this work, we can give ourselves a space in which to do that. Right. So I think that is how we can take something that feels really esoteric, like you want to get to these higher states of connection and ecstasy and pleasure, but we have to do the grounded work first of like, what does it feel like to actually be in my body and feel sensation, right? Does that make sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense. I feel like the sort of desire that I think is human nature, or maybe you could say, I like to say maybe lower human nature, because there's also human nature that is more aligned with our inner divinity, right? And our human potential, our capacities. But the lower human nature that wants to get more pleasure and get away from more pain is one that I just keep coming back to in our culture. Not just American culture, which I think is probably the worst example maybe, but global culture has been, kind of infected maybe with this materialist desire to just get more pleasure and get less pain. And so I think in the interest of wholeness, I really appreciate what you're pointing toward is this kind of within sacred sexuality, maybe a tendency to engage in like spiritual bypassing and not deal with the injuries that are blocks to opening up channels of pleasure. And, it's so, sometimes it's it can be very gross level, but then sometimes extremely subtle. And I feel like the more one develops along the spiritual path, the more subtle those tendencies, the harder they are to catch. But they're still there because we still have an ego, no matter how far we go, So I'm appreciating you starting the conversation with that.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, our bodies are wired to go towards pleasure and away from pain. Right? That's how they're meant to be. Right. So it makes sense. Yeah.
I have a kind of a logistical question for you, Amanda, which is when you're talking about moving the energy or being with the energy of these different contractions or pain in our body in different parts. And let's just say, I think you used the navel as an example. If you're working with, did you say that was like self-doubt and
receptivity and worthiness? Yes.
So in your experience, as you're working with those themes, do you actually feel in your body an opening? Like, do you feel a related, very direct noticing of, I feel actually more worthy, and I actually then feel more of an energetic freeness in my navel area? Is that how you experience it?
So I love that question, because I think a lot of what this is, sometimes you do have to practice. I feel like that's part of it, is practicing, because we do have to kind of teach our bodies and beings new ways to be with each other. And so that's why I often encourage people to have not only practices they do together, but a solo practice. So for example, if you are wanting to connect more to your navel or to your womb, for example, the energy of that space, even just spending time breathing into that space, spending time bringing your awareness and intention. And that can take time to learn, like, what are the sensations I'm feeling? And is it pain? And is it, disconnection, or is it numbness, or whatever it is? And really kind of letting yourself be with what's there. And over time, I noticed in my own experience, there was not a lot of, I could not connect to any sensation at first. I was like, this is dumb. Like, what is this? This makes no sense. I'm supposed to breathe into my womb. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. But then after doing it for a while, I was like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden, like, I was really listening and I was tuning in, and there was like messages that my body had for me.
Wow.
And I was like, this makes so much sense. Wow. Is it any wonder that I have really bad cramps when I have all this interesting information that was coming out, and it came through, maybe feeling certain pains or tension, and then kind of just like breathing into that for a minute and noticing as I give more time and attention with that place, maybe there was emotion that wanted to come out. Like, I had a lot of grief, and I had a lot of like ache, and, and it doesn't always happen overnight, right? I think I did, a lot of practice around this, but over time I became able to really feel more, and then it would feel like warm. And now when I tune into it, I can really feel like tingles of pleasure and openness. And when I feel disconnected, or if I feel like, it feels like a place I can go, I can connect and find some good sensations. And if I spend enough time, usually there's some good insights that come too, because it is like a seat of creativity and power. So it is something you can connect to. And for me, it is a pleasant sensation now.
We hope you're enjoying this episode. I want to take a quick break to let you know about a gift we created for you and your partner. We compiled our top 10 relationship agreements that have been so powerful in supporting the success of our partnership that we even turned them into our wedding vows. These agreements help us stay connected, growing, and thriving as a couple, and they've been critical to help us create a kind of we that's way beyond what we've ever experienced before. You can download this free gift at KristaVanderveer.com. That's KristaVanderveer.com. Also, if you enjoy our podcast, it would be so meaningful to us if you left us a rating and review. Not only does it help others find us, but it gives us critical feedback on how we're doing. Thanks in advance, and now back to the episode. I love this conversation, and it sounds like there's a lot of the somatic experiencing that you're talking about inside of this conversation, which is also what I'm hearing is an aspect of your definition of sacred sexuality. Yeah.
Because it's really about liberating energy and liberating that ability to take the energy, and instead of like it going down and out, like if you think about a lot of times, if people just want a really quick orgasm, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I'm not judging any kind of pleasure anyone gets, but sometimes we're just like in a really fast-paced environment. And, with the lives that we live, that we're just like, okay, I just have 5 minutes. I just get they're going to get the vibrator and have the orgasm or whatever. Or like, we're going to have a really quick connection and that'll be fine. And sometimes, that's fine. But if that's like the way it is every single time, there's probably not a lot of presence and connectivity and sensation and pleasure happening. But and often that kind of is like the energy, you feel it and it's just like, whoosh, and then it goes down and out. And really when we are learning to build the energy, we take it and we really let it build and pay attention to the sensation and use, a lot of holistic sex tools like breath and intention and movement and sound and all these things to kind of let that energy grow and build. And then it starts to come up through your body. So you can take that pleasure. That's when people are talking about full body orgasm. That's it. You feel the sensations, but they're not just localized in one area. You can take them and you can kind of spread them through your body, and that energy moves so that it's a definite, and you can get into these altered states, which again, like, a lot about when we are in these altered states, our brains can make new connections. And I think that's some of the, if you do deep enough meditation or breath work or whatever it is, you can get to those different states. that often people enjoy.
Totally. I love this conversation for many different reasons. Will, do you want to jump in or do you want me to keep going here?
I guess at the risk of maybe going a little too meta, I keep it keeps coming up, the question about our relationship with pleasure, just in general. And I would say sexual pleasure has its own very specific kind of cultural layering that's super intense in our culture. But just pleasure in general, I think is really, I'm just reflecting on like the way I talk about pleasure in my life. And like with my inner circle of dudes, like we talk about chasing dopamine, we talk about going for the shiny object. And, these are things that we call each other out about, and we try not to kind of get derailed in our lives in that way. But there's a negative kind of association that I'm just kind of realizing in this moment of the way I talk about pleasure in general is like, oh, it's off course from mission and purpose and achievement and whatever things. So it's interesting that I'm not allowing myself permission to have more pleasure in my life, to have a different, maybe more nuanced and neutral maybe attitude about it. I'm curious what you have to say about our cultural experiences of pleasure.
That is so true. And that is one of the reasons why it can feel so hard, because our culture really doesn't celebrate pleasure. It doesn't drive us towards pleasure. It's more about productivity and getting things done. And specifically, a lot of the messaging that men receive is all around, you got to provide, you got to, step up. You can't mess around. You've got to, there's no time for that. No time for emotions, all of that. And so, and often these patterns, we can become very successful because of them, right? Typically those goal-oriented behaviors serve us well in life. Mm-hmm. And often these success patterns that serve us well in business, they then sometimes limit that intimate connection, because we sometimes come to it with a goal, right? My goal is to have an orgasm, or my goal is to like get this done, or I want to feel connected, so I'm going to do this, and then I'll feel more connected. So it's like really there's like this achievement-based relating happening. Mm-hmm. Right. Versus like
guilty as charged.
Well,
we can all do it. Like we all go there.
I would say you are guilty as charged, but I want to stand for how we've been doing, how the art of we, what the perspective is from the art of we, and how we've actually been really working that inside of our relationship.
Right. A good idea.
Like we really stand for intentionality. We're really standing for regulation, prioritizing regulation, which we have noticed, and we've talked a lot about this recently, how much more we do have access to pleasure because of the work that we've done. And so I find that there's this beautiful way that we've been working this. We also have been in a lot of conversations historically with female leaders about how, from my perspective, if we're doing the soul aligned work in the world, we are actually feeling turned on in our bodies. And so I think that there's a really beautiful coming together between you and me, Will, about how we do relationship. So I don't want people who are listening just to put you in the category that you just put yourself into, because I don't think it's totally accurate.
Well, I mean, it is an achievement-based mentality a lot of the time. I'll just say that. But we do have, I love what Amanda said about practices, that you need to practice. And I think that we do a really good job in our partnership of practicing downregulation, connection, really attending to the animal nervous system of, when we leave each other's presence, when we come back into each other's presence, we have specific things we do to really support those sometimes tenuous, moments in a connection. And, I would love to hear you, maybe if you're open to it, Krista, share your journey with your sexuality and your experiences that you brought into our relationship that helped you feel more connected to your body and your pleasure. Because when I met you, I felt kind of daunted because you had done work with your sexuality that I hadn't done with mine. And that was really good for me, actually, to, here comes the achievement again, to need to, sort of step up my game.
Yeah. And maybe there's some coaching Amanda can give us here about where we are now, because not that there's anything wrong, but I am curious what, Amanda, you would say to our journey. So I did a lot of work early on, and Mom and Dad, you might want to turn off the episode. I won't say anything too explicit, but I did do some work early on. And this was like these workshops that some of us doing more of this authentic relating here in town would do. And we would go to these workshops, which did have the flavor of Tantra and sacred sexuality. But what it really felt like it was a demonstration about how to get each other off. And while I walked away being like, wow, I learned a lot of stuff, I also walked away feeling pretty gross. Like, I don't know how I really feel about this and if I'll come back and do this again. But then I did do a deep dive of about 9 months in-person immersion with a bunch of women who were teaching other women how to really be with our bodies. I would consider this sacred sexuality. It was wiping away all the indoctrinated cultural messaging and actually getting in these deeper touch with our bodies. Like you were saying, the emotions, what's coming up. And that was a really big game changer for me. And I would imagine that's a lot of the work that you're doing, Amanda, with clients. And shortly after being in that immersion, my then partner passed away. And then I was single. And there was actually this really beautiful period of being single where I brought a lot of that work into my grief, my healing, my own relationship with myself and my soul and my spirit and all the things that sexually that was actually really, really, really potent. And I think that's what you're speaking to, Will, is when we met, I was really in that practice. And I think that we have taken some of these practices into our life, but I also think we've gotten a little bit away from the deeper intentionality at times of that. Like we have this practice that we call skin time, where it's basically like put our skin on each other's skin and feel what's there. And skin time has kind of devolved into like not really skin time, but just intimacy, which I wouldn't say it's devolved, but the intention of it has kind of fallen away. So maybe there's something there that you can share with us about what you would suggest that we might want to start practicing from your experience to bring more of this intentional sacred sexuality back into our everyday or every week time together.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for sharing all that. And I think that it's, when we're looking at inviting our wholeness to sex, that's one of the things that, Tantra will say in this Neo-Tantric teachings, where we are able to, instead of judging parts of ourselves, maybe it's the achiever part, maybe it's whatever, the emotional part, that we can bring all that in to our sexual experience. And that's not what we've ever seen or been taught. Right. So if we're fully letting go during sex, that could be, you could have emotions, you could get angry, you could get really primal. And we're often scared of that. So we don't allow ourselves to surrender to those levels. And I think too, like learning to hold space for each other, to be that full and to be able to have all the aspects, because, whether it's fully allowing your emotionality or even if there is, that's fine if there's sometimes a goal, because we can have that too. But really, it sounds like that skin to skin time is that beautiful presence, and that just being together and just feeling the skin, feeling the sensation with no goal. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes that can be such a beautiful place to be, because we can notice all the things that come up with that. Or maybe it's like, oh, now what are we going to do? Am I going to feel pressure? Do I want it? What else is going on? Like we can just be present with all the thoughts and all the things that our bodies do in that experience, and just kind of notice it and hold it. And like be really kind to ourselves. Like, wow, I really notice there's a part of me that's like wants to have sex right now, and I'm really mad. I just have to sit here and touch. Or there's a part of me that's like, oh, I need to really fold those clothes. But then we can like change. We start working with our mind to like be present, and let that be a meditation of just like feeling the skin. What does it feel like to notice to be together? Like, where is it warm? What else do I notice? And I think that's such a beautiful practice. And I think that's when we're talking about somatic sex and things of that nature, that's one of the really basic practices, is like being able to just be together and connect to the sensations without any kind of goal, but just being present. I love that you do that. And it's normal that we, like life, we're always busy. Things change. So it's good to just always know. And we can be like, oh, I acknowledge where we are. Maybe I'm noticing that we have kind of shifted what we do during this time. And maybe let's reconnect to our intention, or what do we want this to look like? Or how could we both enjoy it more? Like, is there anything else you need to receive here? Just have the conversation that you so eloquently teach people how to do here, about that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. We actually did something really beautiful the other day, which Will, you were really leading this. It was after the election happened, and we were having skin time, and you helped kick us off around a deeper connection around just being, what does your body have to say about the election results? And I tuned into my body and came up with a bunch of really deep insights about what my body was actually feeling about it. Not my head, but my body. And really got some big valuable nuggets for not just my life, but also from being together in those moments. I feel like naming our states about what we're thinking about, whether it's the laundry, like you said, or like a part of me doesn't want to be here right now, or a part of me wants this, a part of me, whatever. I think naming it really helps move the energy. And if we can be in the agreement with our partner that if I say a part of me doesn't want to have sex with you right now, or doesn't want to be intimate with you right now, can we hold that as okay versus that's the way it is, or you don't want me, or there's something wrong?
Yeah. It's really powerful what you're talking about, Amanda, of bringing the wholeness to the bedroom, right? That, I mean, it's performance, really, ultimately, right? It's like I want to put a certain thing forward and I want to keep a certain thing in the shadow or behind the performance. And it's kind of like stingy is what I'm feeling right now. It's like it's not generous to all of us, to the wholeness of all the parts of us, to refuse to even look to see if there are other parts that have things that they need to be known about.
I think that is so true. And I think even just being aware of that, and even in a sexual experience, if you're noticing that, sometimes it can be okay to just pause, right? And just say, this part is really wanting to do something else. And you can be like, that's okay. You know, what is that? What might that part need to be a little more present? Or can we just give that part a minute? We can always just pause and come back. And I think that's the other thing, that sometimes it can kind of feel like it will derail things. But if you kind of have that commitment that we'll come back to it, like, let's just have a pause and then we can get back to what we're doing. And if it derails things, we'll deal with that. But most of the time, when you can kind of teach yourself to have those pauses, then you can pick back up. I think that's one of the things too about when we can start to work with our sexual energy and letting it be a container to heal, that we can use our sexual encounters as not only, you know, it's not always going to be some ritual, but when we have those deeper opportunities to connect and really process and be together and hold each other in that, and you can take turns, you know, surrendering and receiving and giving and conquering. It's like you get to embody all these different aspects of yourself and play in that realm. And it can be such a healing experience. I think through creating those types of containers to play like that then you feel so much better afterwards. You feel so much more creative, and then you want to do it more. And so it's not just about the pleasure that's part of it, but it's also like, so much more has come from this. And I realize it can be more than I thought possible.
For sure. Amanda, I would love for you to talk a little bit more, and you were kind of pointing to it, and you mentioned it earlier on the podcast about trauma, sexual trauma, and the possibility for healing inside of intimacy with your partner. I'm curious what you would say to the person who's listening who gets pretty stuck or contracted or limited in their capacity because they do have some deep trauma.
I think with that, I always encourage to get support, because oftentimes there's some things we just can't work through on our own. But the more we can kind of learn how to hold ourselves, and when we work with a practitioner, we can get better skills of like, oh, when this comes up, I realize what my body needs and what I can do, or how I can tell my partner to help me if this happens. Say, for example, if you are someone who maybe goes into like freeze or disconnection, sometimes, not always, but the more you kind of pay attention, you can get more clear. If you think of a scale of like red, yellow, green, there's also blue. And blue can be like, I can feel like I might be moving into a place where I'm going to go away. Can we pause and like just look in my eyes, or like touch let me feel you. Things like that you can bring your awareness back to something that is connecting. Then that's sometimes a way to like, okay, come back, versus just let you going through the motions. You can't always catch it, but the more you practice, you can get more discerning of noticing, like right before I go into a pattern that I don't want to do anymore. And I would say too, what we can do is develop our own practice. I think that's some of the most healing that I had was around my own personal, I call it a sacred self-pleasure practice, because it really is tuning into my body, being in consent with myself, learning what my body likes and doesn't like, and where are the points where I need to work through some things, right? Maybe there's places on my body where if that gets touched, it's like an immediate trigger. And so I can be with that and be like, what else needs to happen here? How can I be more loving and bring in some compassion here? And also going very, very slow. One of the things that one of my teachers told me, which is so true, especially around sexuality, is that we can only go as fast as the slowest part of us is ready to go. We cannot push it. And we're achieving people. Most of us be like, I want this to be solved yesterday. Why do I still have this after all these years? But it's like just being patient and like really trusting that slow part.
Yeah. Thank you. I love hearing you speak to that. We speak a lot about trauma in different ways. We don't really directly talk about sexual trauma on this podcast so far. So it's good to be bringing that element in because I think it's such an important part of our healing, our wholeness, like you're saying. And I know there's a lot of people who need a lot of support with that. There's a kind of a linear conversation that I want to touch on before we close, because I'm just like, I could be talking to you for a couple hours here. I want to ask you about a typical male perspective that I think gets confused with Tantra or sacred sexuality, which is this concept that the man should be lasting as long as possible. And if he's evolved and developed and doing the quote unquote right thing, then he should be able to last for a very long time inside of a sexual encounter. Will, I don't know if you want to add anything to that perception as a cultural, American male perception, but I would be curious, Amanda, how you respond to that, unless there's something you want to add to that, Will.
I mean, there's $1 billion pharmaceutical industry behind that, so that's a whole other story. I think it's also connected in with, for men, and I think I can speak for myself and men that I've talked to about this, that there's this shame around not delivering the pleasure to the woman. But it's not the kind of pleasure that we're talking about here with Amanda. It's the kind of pleasure of the orgasm, right? And okay, I checked that box. I satisfied my woman. I gave her, quote unquote, an orgasm. And therefore, I'm not at risk of being abandoned or thrown out with the garbage or whatever. So that's a heavy, heavy message for guys. And so I think when men are accused, fairly accused of being goal-oriented and going after the orgasm, I think that is a part of what we're working with over here as guys, is that many of us have a terrible concern, fear, that if our woman doesn't have pleasure or an orgasm, it's bad news for our relationship, because some guy out there is going to be able to do that for you, right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of like the achiever mentality, I guess.
I appreciate you sharing that tender truth, Will, because it is a big thing, like that wanting to please and feeling, if I don't do a good job, then I'm going to be out and there's someone else that can do it. I think from both sides, we can hear those messages. And, I think too, when it comes to performing, and I know, Krista, your question was more around like lasting. And when you're talking about sacred sexuality, it's not so much about the erection or it's more about the energy and the connection. And so I think too, when you can focus more on that, there's a lot of stress that you can take off of that pressure to perform, because sometimes that can even show up in the way of performing, right? Because there's a lot of stress, and then that can inhibit erections too. And like when it comes to erectile dysfunction, there's a lot of things to make sure, like number one, I just want to always have people check their health and make sure that there's no other health issues going on. But also just realizing like this is something too, when we're talking about having our own pleasure practices, that even with penis owners, men can do this too, right? Like, and one of the things that I often say is that it's also bringing acceptance to whatever is. When we're talking about wholeness, is like, there can be such beauty and power in a soft, penis. So thinking about that, we really have to change our mindset around what sex looks like. Mm-hmm. And also realizing there can be a time for softness and surrender, and still there can be pleasure and connection. And maybe it just looks a little different, because there's millions of ways to still be intimate and bring connection and pleasure to each other without an erection. So I think that is kind of like you say, that is one of the misconceptions, but I think that's often what's sold, because that's what the messaging is out there, right? That men want this. So let's sell this like amazing outcome, which is true, right? That can happen. You can last longer and have better connection, less pressure on yourself. And there could be other things that are wrapped up in there that you can always work through. Some of my clients, we work through these things, and then they realize like, oh, I realize like the stress level is part of what it is. Mm-hmm. So of course I'm not going to be able to, get into a place where I can even have pleasure. So there's layers, like you said, there's layers.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Amanda, again, there's so much rich content in this conversation. I feel so grateful for you taking the time to come on with us, we might have to have a part 2
I think so.
in the future. So we can get into some other layers here because it's such a rich conversation and valuable conversation. But before we head out today, I'm wondering how people can find you, and if they want to find out more about you, what's the best place to go? And if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up for today.
Yeah, I just thank you both so much again for sharing these vulnerable conversations. And I think that's how we learn. And I really appreciate you having me here. Mm-hmm. And for those who are listening, you can find me at my website. It's amandatesta.com. I also have a podcast called Find Your Feminine Fire. And I speak a lot about these kind of topics there. So you can find me at those places. And I do have some free gifts for you if you want to go to amandatesta.com/thegoods. Get the goods, amandatesta.com/thegoods, and you can go there as well.
Great. And we'll put all of those links in the show notes. And thank you again, Amanda. We're so grateful. And yeah, if you're open to it, we'll do a part 2 sometime.
I would love it.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you. And thank you for listeners for joining in. We are so grateful to have you in our community. And if you want to reach out to Amanda, please do so. And if you are enjoying the content on this podcast, we would so appreciate you leaving a rating and review because it helps us understand what we're doing great, how we can improve, and also helps people find us. So thank you again and have a wonderful weekend.